Welcome to the Transform Your Relationship podcast, where we'll go beyond the typical relationship advice. I'm your host, Manisha Terry, somatic healing practitioner and mentor. Each week, I'll share personal insights, client success stories, and how my holistic trauma-informed approach can help you transform your relationship from the inside out. You'll learn ways to recognize and prioritize your needs, get to the root of what's upsetting you, and courageously ask for what you want so you can confidently co-create the relationship you desire. You'll also hear from guest experts who will be invited to share their unique approaches to transformation, and at the end of each episode, you'll receive one tangible practice you can implement right away to transform your relationship. Let's dive in. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of the Transform Your Relationship podcast. If you are new here, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here. And for those of you who are new to me, my name is Manisha Terry. I'm a somatic healing practitioner, and I primarily work with highly sensitive people and support them through somatic modalities to thrive in their relationships. And this is a topic, an area that I really love to work in because I am definitely highly sensitive. And in addition to a ton of personal experience having various challenges in relationships because of my high sensitivity, I have since gone on to study many different modalities to help me personally ground and reconnect with myself, and also really understand my sensitivity, how it shows up in relationships. I've gone on to work with many clients who almost always identify as highly sensitive, even if they don't realize it at the time we start working together. And they really come to see how some of these traits, while they ultimately, many of them do feel like gifts, in the process of understanding them and working with them and learning to navigate them, there can be a lot of challenges, which is one of the reasons I wanted to bring this episode to you today and really talk about some of these traits or characteristics of being highly sensitive and how we really can lean into them as a gift in our relationships. The other reason I thought it would be interesting to talk about this right now, or that it's coming up for me right now, is that I had participated in a summit called the Sensitive Success Summit. And if you are listening in October of 2023, it is still going on until the end of the month. And there were a ton of speakers who spoke about sensitivity in a lot of different contexts, in work contexts, in relationship contexts, in the context of art and creativity. And so I will put a link in the show notes if you are interested in checking that out. My particular talk was around some of the challenges in relationships, being a highly sensitive person. And of course, we also got to how those things can turn into gifts over time as we learn about this trait and learn how to navigate it. So I thought it would be a helpful conversation to also bring over to the podcast. And if you're not familiar with the term highly sensitive, I would really encourage you to look up Elaine Aron and the highly sensitive person. She is the person who coined this term, and a few of the ways that I see it show up in relationships, so you can even decide if that's something you resonate with and you want to look up further, is that when you're highly sensitive, you can definitely take in external stimuli in a very different way than other people. So you might be overloaded with sights, sounds, lights, like different things in a way that other people just aren't. You might not love crowds, feel easily overwhelmed. You might feel a lot of emotions. Maybe people have even told you you are too sensitive, or why are you reacting that way, or things like, what's the big deal? And, one of the reasons is because when you're highly sensitive, you do take the world in a different way. And there are some specific traits that I'll definitely talk about as we continue. But this taking in the world in this way can overload your system much faster than other people's systems get overloaded. So you might even feel reactive or easily triggered, or you feel like you're taking things personally. These are 100% things that I have definitely felt. And I will say that you don't have to be a highly sensitive person, certainly, to feel these things. However, if you are highly sensitive, your threshold for tipping into that space might be a little bit different simply because of the way you take in information from the outside world. And again, I will always be a champion of this trait because I really do think that the nature of being sensitive can actually allow one to have really deep and meaningful and very connected relationships. I think, honestly, they're the kind of relationships that people want. Like, they want to feel a sense of belonging, like they're seen and they're heard. And you might even go through your life being somebody on the receiving end of a lot of people wanting to share with you and wanting to get your advice, because you do have this quality of being able to be present and listen and take in information and really give somebody your full attention. And while this is a really beautiful trait, I think sometimes what happens with this also is that there are a lot of people that might come to you and seek you out because of this trait, but you end up feeling quite drained by it or quite depleted by it. And so when you really truly understand your sensitivity and learn how to work with it, your senses will really be able to help you discern which relationships also feel good for you and which ones are reciprocal and which ones feel more like they're one way and they're really more taking from you and there isn't a healthy back and forth in the relationship. And this can happen, of course, in any relationship, in friendships, coworkers, family, of course, romantic partnerships. And there are absolutely ways to start to shift this dynamic if you've been involved in this. And I'll say at the same time, most highly sensitive people are very empathic and compassionate. So sometimes it can be difficult to set those boundaries and even fully trust that the other person may not be the healthiest, because there is a lot of, I find, overextension of compassion. So these are a few of the things that I'm going to dive a little bit further into. And as full disclaimer, this is not based on any kind of research or anything like that. It is really from my perspective, so a mix of my personal experiences and also what I have really seen across the board in the decades plus that I have been working one-on-one with clients and hearing their stories and understanding their relationship dynamics and seeing how some of these traits play out in their relationships. So I already alluded to the first one in being very compassionate, or I would say empathetic. So as an highly sensitive person or HSP, people tend to have a really attuned ability to sense into other people's feelings and needs and insecurities. They are just able to tap into that very naturally. So it doesn't even feel like something that they're doing or working at. There is simply a level of tuning in to somebody else's emotional state that really allows you to be empathetic, which I think that most people can see the gift in that empathy is a really good thing at any time to help with understanding, to help with recognizing the other person's perspective or side in a situation. You might be a little bit more forgiving, give somebody grace. I think that can really support relationships over time. And at the same time, when we are very compassionate and empathetic, that grace can definitely be overextended, or we can lean into being too understanding and really end up people pleasing or just giving somebody so much leeway that it ends up taking up a lot of your bandwidth and your energy. And you're not really setting boundaries because you fall into this arena of, well, I really want to give this person space. They're going through XYZ. And so this is a tricky one, right? Because you don't want to ever say well, I don't want to be a compassionate person and I don't want to be understanding, but it's really about finding that middle ground for you to make sure that, yes, you're being an empathetic, compassionate human, and you're also taking care of yourself where you're not overextending and depleting yourself. So while it is absolutely a gift, I think some of the ways we have to pay attention or perhaps rethink the way we approach this is recognizing, where is the line here for me? What can I do in this particular situation or relationship where I still feel good, but I don't feel overextended and depleted? And that's going to be different for each person. Another thing that I see with HSPs is that we're very detail oriented, and this can be really great. Like, we remember things. If somebody tells us something about something they like or they don't like, we often follow up on it. We're paying attention, we're perceptive. And so sometimes in a room, we might even be able to walk in and anticipate the needs of some people in the room. I mean, this could be with your spouse, it could be with your children, it could be at your workplace. Like, this is an incredible gift because you can walk in, kind of assess the situation, those spidey senses are at work, and you're really able to address a lot of things without them being spoken out loud. However, again, this can be a massive drain on energy over time if you're not careful. People can tend to expect this, and then you are kind of stuck in this cycle where you're constantly doing that. And I have also seen in relationship dynamics where people do this and they do it so naturally and so beautifully that they almost expect the other person to reciprocate that, even if the other person doesn't necessarily have that skill. So this took me a while to understand that not everybody has this skill. And to be fair, how would you know what someone else is able to perceive and not until you understand more about that person, how they operate? And I think that this can create a lot of friction, especially in romantic relationships, because if one person is HSP and the other person isn't, and they're doing all of these things because that's how they naturally are oriented to anticipate, to be responsive, to not have to be necessarily told all of these things, it can feel like the other person doesn't maybe care for them in the same way, not care about them, but sort of care for them in the same way because they're not doing the same thing back. But I think one of the things to really understand and recognize here is that not everybody has those skills and those abilities. And just as a partner or someone else you're in a relationship with can understand your sensitive traits, I think it's important for people who are sensitive to recognize that not everybody can show up in that way. And so, again, every relationship is different. And if that's super, super important to you, that might be a non-negotiable, but also to recognize that this person may simply not be capable of this, and you get to decide whether that's okay for you. Another trait that I see come up often, or conversation I have often, is that when you're in a relationship and someone is giving you feedback, and it could be very general or kind feedback, or of course it could certainly be a criticism, but I find that when one is highly sensitive, there's such a deep connection between the feedback and taking it really to heart and taking it very personally, like it is a full reflection of that person. And it can feel a bit like an attack, or the person can become more defensive. And again, you don't have to be a highly sensitive person, obviously, to be defensive in your communication or in your reactions. But I do find that people who are highly sensitive, like, we just take things like very, very close to our hearts. And so that, obviously, I don't think I need to explain how the challenges are in that, especially in a romantic relationships. If you notice that, okay, we're having this fight again, we're talking about the same thing again, I'm feeling attacked again. So if you notice something like this happening, I find that there's definitely some work to do around being able to pause and separate what somebody is saying from you as a person. And ultimately, I do think with some work around this, some recognition, and also really just developing our ability to sit with something and take literally a pause and slow everything down so that our bodies don't have this automatic reaction, which is why I think somatic work can be so important, because it can help you sort of hold that discomfort and not speak out right away or take some kind of action right away, but kind of hear something or see something and be able to sit in that moment with some of that discomfort and let that diffuse and dissipate so that you can start to do that work of separating what somebody is saying from, how it maybe immediately makes you feel. And then over time, really becoming, using this recognition and understanding to become a better communicator over time. Because when you can pause and reflect and separate that out a bit, you can ask clarifying questions. Like if somebody has said something that genuinely just doesn't feel good or you don't understand it, instead of reacting and making an assumption in that way. And I definitely have been guilty of this and still can fall into this trap. So no matter how much work you do on it, just know that, sometimes those base reactions are so present. And when you're not doing other things to feel more grounded or take care of your nervous system, it's not unnatural that you're going to just feel a little bit more activated or agitated. So I'm just going to put that out there. But over time, when you're able to take that space and pause, you can ask clarifying questions like, hey, what did you mean by that? Or I noticed you said this, or when you said this, it made me feel XYZ. And so working with this, trait, I suppose, over time can actually help in the long run of being able to learn some of these skills of pausing, feeling more grounded, being able to communicate, with really genuine curiosity. Like at first, it might just feel like you're going through the motions because it still feels like there's a bit of a sting. But over time, I think we really can get to a place where we don't have to take things so to heart because one, we recognize, well, everybody operates in a different way. And two, we have the power to ask those questions and then actually invite the other person to also think, well, what did I mean? Why did I say this? And I find that over time, this can really separate out people in a good way. Like you really start to notice the people who maybe are purposely or maybe not intentionally, but they are speaking to you in a more critical way. And you get to notice that and recognize that when you ask these questions about why or what did you mean, like again, with genuine curiosity. But then you also get to see this other category of people who maybe you've just assumed that they think a certain thing about you or that they feel a certain way about you. And then they get to just explain also very appropriately, oh, this is what I meant, or this is what I think. And it can actually help you strengthen those relationships with those people. And then also decide for the other folks who might be critical, maybe it's unconscious, whatever the story is, that you need less of them in your life, right? And of course, that's a bigger conversation because depending on who this person is, you're obviously going to handle that in various ways. But I find that this can actually ultimately be a gift because it does make you a better communicator. And I think it can help you strengthen the kinds of relationships that you actually feel good being in. And the last thing I'll talk about in the context of being a highly sensitive person is that I definitely have seen and experienced this sense of over responsibility or just taking things on or feeling responsible for things that you're definitely not responsible for. And this can play out in a few different ways. I think on the not so great side, you might end up taking control over a lot of situations where maybe you can divide up the responsibility, but you take full control over it, which ultimately over time can lead to burnout and feelings of resentment and all of these types of things. I think on the plus side, in a relationship, sometimes, it can really lead to the other person feeling very cared for, right? Like if you take on something and you take care of it, depending on the situation, somebody else that you're in a relationship can feel like, wow, this person cares about me and they want to support me and they want to, take responsibility for like XYZ thing. But I think you can see over time that's probably not sustainable in the context of a relationship, because there can be this feeling of, well, I'm always doing everything. And even though you are actually initiating that kind of control and wanting to take care of everything, I think over time it can definitely lead to an imbalance in a relationship that can start to create some resentment over time. So I would say if you are noticing this in the context of your relationships, then really start to pause and examine like where you are, maybe taking responsibility for an actual thing that needs to be done, but also where you might be taking responsibility for another person's feelings in a situation. And, the way this can certainly play out is if you know somebody else is going to get upset because of something you are wanting to express, but you really feel like it's important to express that for your own sake, for whatever reason, then it can a lot of times lead to people not saying anything, procrastinating, kind of, skirting around issues. And it can lead to a lot of communication issues because you are so overly concerned about the way somebody may respond that you end up changing your behavior. So again, I don't know that I need to go much further in expressing or explaining like how and why that can be problematic, because there's like an inauthenticity there, right? Because you're so concerned about somebody else. And so, that can lead to a lot of challenges in relationships because you're just not showing up fully as yourself in a lot of different ways. And so again, like where you can pull back here and start to recognize that you are doing it, that's going to give you some more space to really consider some of the deeper issues underneath that. Like, why do I feel like I need to do this? Do I not feel like this other person can handle what I have to say? And so it can just lead to a lot of codependent type issues, which can be challenging in relationships. But again, like the pro in this, when I think it's done in a way where it's not overdone, is another person in a relationship can definitely feel like you're anticipating things, you're sensing into things, you are, taking responsibility, and another person can feel really cared for. And in some situations, that's like super, super appropriate. And in a lot of other situations, it can lead to some of the things that I just shared. If some or a lot of what I am sharing is resonating with you, you might wonder, okay, well, what do I do with this? And I certainly shared a few things that you can do in terms of reflecting on it. But I think one big thing, or maybe the first thing to do sort of globally, is just recognize and accept that this is like part of who I am. I am a highly sensitive person. These are traits that I have, and I have to learn about them and figure them out and figure out how they show up in different places. And you might be a person who is very well aware of your sensitivity. Maybe all of these things are pretty familiar to you. Maybe you've done a ton of work on them already, and you will probably still see them show up in like sneakier ways, or ways that you were definitely not expecting or anticipating. And so I would just say that if you are noticing friction in a relationship, or you're feeling like you can't fully say what you mean, or you feel like you are taking an undue amount of stress on due to a relationship and you're a highly sensitive person, you might just kind of pause and reflect on, are any of these things affecting my ability to see clearly in this relationship, to make good decisions, to, take over or feel over responsible, or be so empathetic that, I'm not able to see clearly. And I've definitely had these experiences with people over time. And I think that it's not black and white. That's all I'll say. This is not like a thing where, okay, I'm just going to quote unquote fix this and it's not going to happen anymore, it will probably show up again in sneaky ways. So one, just recognizing like, okay, I'm a person who has a lot of compassion and empathy, and sometimes I will get sucked into other people's situations because I feel really bad and want to be helpful, and then end up in a situation where I'm feeling overextended and resentful and frustrated and all of the things. And so once you can accept that that is a possibility and you might go there, then you can figure out, okay, well, how can I walk myself back from this situation? And one of the things that personally helps me do that, and something I 100% help my clients with, is figuring out what helps you feel more grounded, right? And soothes your nervous system. Because often when you're sucked into a dynamic, you're not thinking clearly, your nervous system's activated, you might be replaying an old pattern from a different time in your life that you are not even conscious of. And so when you can do things that help you feel grounded, connected to yourself, connected to nature, I find that we can simply just be in a more neutral state so that we can see a situation more clearly and then figure out what to do from there. And if you're curious about what I mean by like how to support your nervous system or feel more grounded, I did an episode earlier, I believe it's episode 7, where I talk about just different self-care activities that are really a balm for your nervous system, and how different activities can support certainly different types of people to really help them, feel grounded, more clear. And so when you're able to get to that place where you're feeling more grounded and more clear, then you can also do that deeper work of exploring and figuring out what your triggers are. We're all human. We're going through different things. They're going to bring up like some of our core issues or wounds that set us off or trigger us. And as someone who's highly sensitive, you may have internalized experiences more deeply when you were younger, and they've just been maybe more difficult to release, which again is why I'm such a huge proponent of somatic work, because I do feel that when these, memories are being held in our body, we can definitely talk about them and become more aware of them. But I find that working with our bodies can actually help us to release them. And so there are so many different modalities that can help you do that, to really help you work through those emotional charges, help you regulate your nervous system. And then we keep cycling back through to how can we accept ourselves and how can we give ourselves compassion and really learn to work with these traits and keep leaning into their gifts over time. And as I circle back to a comment that I made earlier in the episode, I'll just remind you all that, when you're more in tune with your own feelings and emotions, and you have these practices that can help you feel more grounded and clear, you can notice how you are in different kinds of relationships, or the different relationships you have in your life. And because you're more connected to yourself and to your instincts and sort of that gut knowing, it can really help guide you towards the relationships that do feel good and that you don't feel as activated, and you can feel like you can relax. And you might notice that in other relationships where you've been doing this work and some of your triggers, but there's something about that person that just doesn't quite feel right, where you can't fully relax, where you are feeling quite hypervigilant. There's certainly more to explore there, but I find that over time, you can trust your body and your instincts to guide you towards the relationships that feel good, and, change the dynamics of the ones that don't, or spend less time with those people, depending on the context of that relationship. I do really find that richer relationships are possible and really inevitable when you lean into your gifts in this way. So I do hope that this has been helpful. I would encourage you for a little personal work or reflection to, reflect on what I've shared, see what lands. If you're curious about highly sensitive traits, you can look up Elaine Aron and Highly Sensitive Person and read a little bit more about it. And you can begin to reflect on, how do some of these traits help me in my relationships? Where might there be more challenges that come up, and think about what supports your nervous system and helps you feel more grounded. And when you find those things, like put them into your schedule. I find that it's like medicine for me. And when I do it, I absolutely feel more grounded and regulated and able to handle the different things that come my way. And when I don't do that for myself, it is very easy to fall into feeling like overwhelmed and anxious and stressed. So do the things that support your nervous system. And I recognize that that is not always easy, and there's time factors and lots of responsibility factors, but I always encourage people to think about what it would be the quality of your time in your relationships if you were able to give this even 5 or 10 minutes a day, but just being consistent with it. And of course, beyond all that, there's always like deeper digging that one can do if you have the time and the inclination, and you really, really notice that these sensitivities are impacting your relationships in a really negative way, or where it's causing you a lot of stress and anxiety. You're not quite sure how to get there yourself. This is the work I do. You can learn more about that and book a one-on-one session with me. All the information is in the show notes if you would like additional professional support. Again, I hope that this was of benefit. I always love to hear your reflections. Feel free to share via email or DM on Instagram, and I will see you the next time. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode of the Transform Your Relationship podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to help more people find us so they can transform their relationships too. As a thank you, every month, we'll pick one winner to receive a free 45-minute one-on-one somatic coaching session with me to explore and gain clarity around a relationship challenge. And if you know somebody who could benefit from listening to the show, then please do share and help me reach more highly sensitive women who want to experience richer, more connected relationships.